In gathering these talks together, we wanted to bring some of the most exciting and provocative thinkers in the environmental humanities to our campus to allow us to have sustained conversations about what intellectual work in and around those fields, traditionally called humanistic, have to offer us as we live into the sixth mass extinction and the phenomenon variously marked as the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, or Eurocene. Across these talks and discussions, we especially want to ask three questions. One, how does a focus on ecology unsettle traditional ideas of personhood, politics, and ethical living? Two, how does mainstream ecological thought need to be unsettled by more radical ideas about how we may survive climate catastrophe? And third, how does thinking seriously about ecology require us to grapple with the settler colonial projects that animate almost all of the pernicious environmental problems we face? In framing it this way, and in using this word unsettling, we wanted to think about what it means, and I'm going to quote here, to turn toward the possibility of other principles of moving forward, the disarticulation of long-settled narratives in favor of new forms of relationality, forms that seek not to escape, but to differently animate the potentiality of the affective arrangements that organize this vision of the American social world. These words are Dana Luciano's from her book, Arranging Grief, Sacred Time and the Body in 19th Century America, published in 2007 in New York University Press's Sexual Culture series, which also won the Modern Language Association's Best First Book Award in 2008. I'm drawn to this book both because it offers enormously important interventions into how we understand the politics of mourning, the production of feelings or affects that bind us to national narratives, and the ways embodiments are tethered to temporalities, what she calls chronobiopolitics. But also because that book already found Professor Luciano grappling with Herman Melville's layered, complex temporal narratives that unsettle how we think, or might think, about the politics of race, gender, sexuality, and space. In her reading in that book of Benito Cereno, Luciano turns to Black radical thinker C.L.R. James, with whom she'll think again this evening, who notes that Melville's story is a kind of failure because it does not invent any, quote, new types of human being. The question of human being, or being human, is at the center of one of Luciano's later projects, the special issue of GLQ, which she co-edited with Mel Chen, entitled Queer in Humanisms. This issue, which from my perspective constitutes the most important intervention into both queer theory and the many interdisciplinary fields pressuring traditional humanist politics and knowledge, begins with Luciano and Chen's essay, Has the Queer Ever Been Human? An essay that has profoundly shaped how many of us conceptualize the question of the human. Staying just in this room, I might note that it animates the decolonial approach to humanism that my colleague Julietta Singh calls dehumanism, and it's one of the most important sources for my work theorizing humanizing assemblages in educational institutions. Professor Luciano's talk this evening is part of a new book project called How the Earth Feels. I heard her read part of a different chapter last year at the capacious Affect Inquiry Making Space conference and was quite literally blown away by it. Luciano, who is a founding collective member at Resilience, one of the first and most important journals in the environmental humanities, is bringing together literary studies, affect theory, queer of color critique, and transnational American studies to imagine an environmental humanities that unsettles so many of the narratives we're used to telling about who we are, how we got here, and where we might be going. And so there is no scholar more fitting to kick off our series, and it brings me enormous joy to welcome Professor Dana Luciano to think with us today.
Wow. Okay, first we have to do the technological adjustments. Is this thing on? You can hear me? I sound fake and amplified and stuff? Okay, good. Okay, second, I have to make sure I don't talk all afternoon. Okay. Yeah, water's there. Okay, good. So you can hear me now, yeah? Okay, so thank you. Thank you all for coming out today. Thank you, Nathan, for really such a generous introduction. I think that generosity is kind of a model of the generous, rigorous, and really impassioned scholarly labor that you bring into the world. Right? So thank you for that, too. I think you all are really fortunate to have him here, and we're fortunate to have him in the world. Thank you also to Emily Tarchikov for taking on the work of arranging my visit that so often goes unthanked. Right? I also want to acknowledge today our indebtedness to the Powhatan nations whose lands we currently occupy. Right? And along these lines, and in light of the topic of my talk in this series, right, to note that among many other issues facing us today, the Matapana and Pamunkey nations, who are both from this area, are currently under threat. Their tribal lands are currently under threat from rising tidal waters caused by anthropogenic climate change, right, which we could see as a further instantiation of the ongoing violence of settler colonial annexation of land and life. Right? And I wanted finally, I guess, in this context, but also I think in the US today, right, to recognize our indebtedness to the bondsmen and women whose stolen lives and labor created the wealth that founded this and so many of our educational institutions, including the one I currently work at and the one I most recently worked at. Right? This is literalized, I've heard in the sort of recent reports that this campus may be built in part over a burial ground for enslaved peoples. Right? But insofar as slavery's afterlives persist in multiple ongoing forms of violence against African Americans, including not only environmental but economic, white supremacist and police violence. Right? I wanted to note also that, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, since you guys are more clued into the locality of these issues than I am, right? That if the environmental justice movement has any hope of succeeding, it needs to find ways to address the intertwining of all of these issues. So the title of my talk is Melville's Anthropocenes, or Anthropocenes is actually how I tend to say it, so we can fight about that pronunciation later. But although I'm just talking about Moby Dick today, so. Now, within the space of a paragraph in the middle of Moby Dick, Herman Melville presciently manages to plot out two common reactions to the Anthropocene, which, in case you somehow hadn't heard, is the proposed name for a new entry in the geological timescale, distinguished by significant and long-term anthropogenic, that's human-caused climate damage to Earth systems. And he manages to throw some light, or perhaps a bit of shade, on the shape of the concept itself. The paragraphs in question occur in the midst of that most deliriously geological of chapters, 104, The Fossil Whale, which contains Ishmael's musings on the paleontological record of the species. The paragraph in question opens thusly, and this is the first half of the first quote on your sheet, if you want to follow along. When I stand among those mighty Leviathan skeletons, skulls, tusks, jaws, ribs, and vertebrae, all characterized by partial resemblances to the existing breeds of sea monsters, but at the same time bearing, on the other hand, similar affinities to the annihilated antichronical Leviathans, their incalculable seniors, I am by a flood, born back to that wondrous period, ere time itself can be said to have begun, for time began with man. Ishmael's recounting of an encounter with whale fossils explores the effect of a radical shift in temporal perspective, one that rests his and the reader's attention away from man and his time, moving it instead toward the incalculable time of planetary phenomena. The history of continual mutation and differentiation that the whale opens to view permits him to pull back from the limits of a human perspective and catch a glimpse of the world otherwise. For latter-day readers, and especially for humanists, the Anthropocene concept exudes something of the same fascination, recalling its addressees to our employment within geological time by virtue of its emphasis on humanity's geological agency. It demands, we are repeatedly told, another way of thinking, of reading, of understanding history, of mapping the planet and our relation thereto. Now, scholarly investment in the renaming of the current geological period resembles Ishmael's interest in the wondrous period before the time of man. Geological wonder, as Noah Herringman and others have argued, inhabits the intersection of the scientific and the aesthetic, becoming an impetus to new forms of knowledge. So too, the Anthropocene proposal, with its undeniably scientific aura, has lured in countless scholars both inside and outside the sciences, the latter perhaps seeking new avenues of approach in the alleged wake of critique or the much remarked disintegration of the human. So for instance, we hear that the Anthropocene requires humanists to scale up our thinking, supplanting human with geologic timescales. Ishmael does this implicitly when he contrasts human histories to the vaster spans connoted by the antichronical Leviathans. Yet he also calls into question the efficacy of this contrast, invoking in his nod to the incalculability of their age, the incompletion of the fossil record, and the ultimate unknowability of the planetary past, a theme much sounding in geological writing of Melville's day, even as the then new, discipline of stratigraphy rushed to reconstruct it. Now, the most recent stratigraphic proposal, the Anthropocene epoch, is often glossed as the age or time of man, since it is predicated on the idea of anthropogenic agency. For Ishmael, this gloss would be redundant, since he asserts that time began with man. Here he seems to equate time with human history, which he evokes largely by means of biblical reference, as opposed to planetary time, which belongs to the whale. I want to argue, though, that Moby Dick can illuminate for us the extent to which the Anthropocene resonates in a narrower sense, the time of man, that is, as the forms of history draped around that particular partial and, as Sylvia Wynter emphasizes, overrepresented form of the human, that invention of recent and European origin, whom Michel Foucault in The Order of Things terms man with a capital M. To say that the time of the Anthropocene begins with overrepresented man is to echo numerous critiques of the term, charging it with falsely universalizing the predicament that it names, with obscuring, as Rob Nixon points out, unequal human impacts, unequal human agency, and unequal human vulnerabilities. The use of the general anthropos also masks particular and located histories that have brought about that predicament, though this concealment is being ameliorated, at least around the humanities and the social sciences, by a handful of replacement terms developed to hone in on those histories, and among those, Nathan mentioned some of them, colonialocene, capitalocene, plantationocene, plasticene. What I want to focus on today, however, is less the epistemic form that the proposed epoch and its cognates have taken than the affects that surround these. I'm arguing that the Anthropocene should not be understood as simply a way of categorizing, but more importantly as a way of inflecting the present. The Anthropocene is not yet and may never become a scientifically recognized period, yet it has already gathered around itself a familiar set of emotional responses: anxiety, melancholy, fear. Ishmael evokes these in his meditation on cetacean geological time. To return to the paragraph in question, when Ishmael puts himself, or rather man, back into the picture, wonder quickly turns to terror. The seductive fascination of geological time seeks into a meditation on finitude, as Ishmael invokes the prospect of human extinction. And this is the rest of that quote, that first quote. Saturn's gray chaos rolls over me, and I obtain dim, shuddering glimpses into those polar eternities when wedged bastions of ice pressed hard upon what are now the tropics, and in all the 25,000 miles of this world's circumference, not an inhabitable hand's breadth of land was visible. Then the whole world was the whale's, and king of creation, he left his wake along the present lines of the Andes and the Himalayas. Who can show a pedigree like Leviathan? Ahab's harpoon had shed older blood than the pharaohs. Methuselah seems a schoolboy. I look round to shake hands with Shem. I am horror-struck at this antimosaic, unsourced existence of the unspeakable terrors of the whale, which, having been before all time, must needs exist after all humane ages are over. Now, the affective shift emerges as the result of a collision between the time of man, whose furthest reaches for Ishmael are indexed in Old Testament reference, and cetacean species time, which wends its way through the far deeper geological past. The former is thereby rendered a mere blink in comparison, a common scalar move among geologically minded humanists then as now. More disturbingly, though, the turn to species time reminds Ishmael of extinction, the eventual endpoint of species life, which is brought too close for comfort through the passage's collapsing timescales. To observe that one species will outlast the other is also to be forced to grapple with the inevitability, underwritten by contemporary geological knowledge, that the time of man itself will one day come to an end. Now, the idea of the Anthropocene has affected the cultural critical imagination in recent years, much as the petrified whale carcasses affect Ishmael's. Alongside its invitation to fascination and wonder, it also lends itself to anxiety and grief, impelled by the specter of an Earth after us. And that's the title of a book published by the Anthropocene Working Group chair, Jan Salashevitz, in 2009. He's a geologist, a stratigrapher. And these have given a familiar shape to the narratives being developed around the Anthropocene concept. Indeed, the Anthropocene seems already to have found its genres, inhabiting the overlap between tragedy and elegiac romance, which are the very genres that characterize the main plot of Moby Dick. Now, a moment ago, I distinguished my affective inquiry into the epic, its focus on grief, fear, and anxiety, from the epistemic debates around it. That is, its naming and framing around overrepresented man, and its consequent false universalism and relatively anodyne historical critique. But these are, I want to argue, at root the same issue. Tragedy and autoelegy have become the genres of the Anthropocene, not simply because, as Ursula Heise points out, they dominate US environmental protest narrative, but because they were already the affective correlatives of the episteme of overrepresented man. In my talk today, I'll use Moby Dick to think about, with, and beyond this account of the Anthropocene. I want in the first place to explore ways that Moby Dick allegorizes the story of the epic taking form in the popular imagination, and to point out some of the insufficiencies of that form, insufficiencies that are, as I've argued, both epistemic, historical, and affective, generic. Following this, I consider some of those cognate models for thinking through the origin of climate catastrophe, specifically 3 of the replacement terms I mentioned above, which I contend hold more promise both in terms of their historical compass and of their affective potentialities. Right? Now, the longer piece that this talk is drawn from thinks through 3 of these cognates, right, which are the Plantationocene, which I address in terms of Pip's ecologies, right, the Capitalocene, which I explore through Ishmael's ecstasies, right, and the Colonialocene, which I consider by way of the Pequod itself and by Queequeg's inscriptions. Right? But for reasons of time today, I'll only discuss the first of these, which is Pip and the Plantationocene. First, a note on method. My title, Melville's Anthropocenes, is a deliberate anachronism. Neither the multiple histories invoked in Moby Dick nor the historical span of Herman Melville's career overlap with the epical framework currently before the International Council of Stratigraphers. Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer's initial proposal for the Anthropocene placed its start date in the late 18th century, based on the invention of the steam engine and the start of the Industrial Revolution. The ensuing discussion saw other proposals, most notably, at least from my opinion, 1610, a year selected by virtue of geologic evidence that may index the aftermath of New World settler colonialism. The International Council of Stratigraphers Anthropocene Working Group went out of its way to reject this proposal in particular. A number of its members wrote an essay on the Anthropocene Review, attacking it on both scientific and political grounds, which sort of make you wonder about its, what it was about that proposal that upset them so. Right. Instead, though, the working group ended up selecting the mid-20th century as the epic's start date. The proposal is based on a number of factors, including the Great Acceleration, the emergence of plastics, and the mass production of animals for food. But the primary marker from a geological perspective is the invention and detonation of nuclear weapons. Now, thinking about Moby Dick in relation to an epic that begins a century after its publication, then, means departing from the usual methodology governing science and literature approaches, wherein literary texts from various historical periods are read alongside the then current scientific debates. Right? This is a method seen, for instance, in my earlier reference of Ishmael's nod to incalculability as reflecting 19th century considerations of geology. Right? Rather, I want now to make the case for allegoresis as a way of reading Moby Dick in line with the multiple crises that Anthropocene seeks and fails to name. Right. I'm influenced here by Elizabeth de Villafre's recent exploration of allegory as a notable form for this moment of planetary climate crisis. De Villafre contends that the predicament named by the Anthropocene generates an especial need for this mode, operating as it does at the disjuncture, she says, between our awareness of the planet as a totality and our experience of embedded place. Right? This is the sort of allegory, a shuttling between 2 kind of stories. Right? It's this latter capacity, the experience of embedded place, that proves useful in de Villafre's quest to provincialize the Anthropocene, to disrupt its Eurocentric account of planetary change in favor of teasing out the histories imbricated in cognates, such as the Plantationocene and Colonialocene. As I'll begin to show today, the larger historical structures indexed in these cognates do thread their way through the pages of Moby Dick, and in the sense they offer a more properly historical frame for assessing Moby Dick as an Anthropocene-adjacent allegory than the nuclear version of the epic. There are no nuclear weapons, by the way, in the mid-19th century, FYI. Still, I'm less interested in crafting a historically appropriate understanding of Moby Dick's allegories, in defining my reading as allegories, that is, that Melville might have had in mind or that would have been available to him as a writer or to his contemporary readers, right, than I am in considering creative allegoresis, the act of reading allegorically, as a mode of grappling with the very texture of the historical, as a means of living through crisis. Right. I'm drawing here on Walter Benjamin's understanding of allegory's importance in a historical moment, the present, in which a crisis demands a new conception of history itself. As numerous critics after Benjamin have asserted, allegory is therefore not simply a means of deciphering a text, but a world-making mode. Now, if, despite Ishmael's insistence that the story of the whale not be read as some hideous and intolerable allegory, allegoresis has been remarkably attracted to Melville's critics. Moby Dick is pretty much an allegory of almost anything you can name. Right? This is because it offers a means of accessing the novel's vitality, what the cultural historian C.L.R. James calls its living relation to the world in which we live. Right? In his 1953 study of Melville's fiction, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, James takes up Melville's novel in the context of a later world historical crisis, the crisis of totalitarianism, which he asserts renders the book instantly recognizable to readers who have lived through the past couple of decades, his past couple of decades. Right? The historical present, that is, actualizes Melville's text. He says, quote, "That which was madness in a book 100 years ago today is the living madness of the age in which we live." Right? And there is also something vitalizing for James in reading through this moment of madness with Melville, looking toward possible alternative futures. Right? And so to re-begin James's project from our own time, right? Reading number 1 is called Ahab's Anthropocene. Right? Now, Moby Dick furnishes a very apt allegory for the Anthropocene written as tragedy. Right? I've described this elsewhere. A powerful and deranged American decides to go to war with nature despite numerous warnings and increasingly incontrovertible evidence that this is not a good idea. Right? And in the end, so if you're reading it right now, you might want to put your hands over your ears. This is your spoiler alert. Right? In the end, everyone dies. Though as far as that stock opposition goes, man versus nature, the novel is even more anthropocenic in its implications. There is no nature in this novel, if by nature we mean a space both exterior and anterior to man, right? And that's a perspective on nature that, as Raymond Williams points out, evolved along with capitalism. Right? It isn't some abstract conception of nature that Ahab goes to war with. It's one particular whale who has been permanently scarred by centuries of conflict with humans. Right? The whale's disfigured body, that is Moby Dick's, indexes the lasting damage done to the space once known as nature in the Anthropocene. Ahab and his crew voyage across the planet only to be done in by a monstrous reflection of human destructiveness. Now, we might see this version of the story as an allegory of Crutzen and Sturmer's original Anthropocene proposal, the epic originating in the late 18th century and driven by industrial capitalism, ever-increasing need for fuel. Right? This is exactly what whaleboats are after. But despite the historical anachrony, it also works as an allegory, a looser allegory of the nuclear Anthropocene, which, as Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, the authors of the 1610 proposal, have observed, understands the epic as essentially American and technological in origin, Ahab being paradigmatically both of those things. In either version, the Anthropocene, however, reads as a classic tragedy of hubristic self-cancellation, another name for which has long been modernity. Dipesh Chakraborty's 2009 manifesto, The Climate of History, 4 Theses, a text which helped bring the Anthropocene concept to the attention of many humanists, right, describes the world historical paradox of modernity in precisely this way, right, as a vision of freedom producing its own negation. The pursuit of freedom, he observes, has been increasingly and disastrously energy intensive, such that freedom is now driving the species to dig its own grave. The image of a self-canceling modernity seems especially attractive to Chakraborty in this essay. He also observes that, quote, "The mansion of modern freedoms stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use," right? And, quote, "The geological agency of humans is the price we pay for the pursuit of freedom." Right? Now, as Ian Balcombe observes, Chakraborty's account transposes a contingent history into a tragic and deterministic register. But it is one whose familiarity helps the epical idea of the Anthropocene make itself at home. The Anthropocene is frequently said to name a situation that is utterly incomprehensible to us, human extinction, and yet it remains a concept we can really easily grasp, insofar as we have trafficked in it for this paradoxical figure of modernity as progressive self-cancellation for quite some time. Those familiar with Foucault's introduction of biopolitics in the first volume of his History of Sexuality might recollect its appearance there. In light specifically of the atomic situation, Foucault remarks that the power to expose a whole population to death is the underside of the power to guarantee an individual's continued existence. Other versions of the paradox follow. Perhaps most famously, the assertion that for millennia, man remained as he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. So it's the crossing place of this chiasmic claim, right, a claim that crosses over rhetorically, is where Foucault identifies what he terms the threshold of modernity, right, the point at which the life of the species is wagered on its own political practices. Right. The alignment of the Anthropocene and the atomic age effectively conflates the epoc's geological boundary marker with the biopolitical threshold of modernity. Right? Now, there's nothing inherently self-canceling about the Anthropocene epoch in geological terms, but this idea has worked its way into the popular imagination of the concept. Right? This is fired in part, I think, by Elizabeth Kolbert's evocative description of the Anthropocene Working Group and of Zalasiewicz, who's the founder of the working group, as a stratigrapher of the future. That's her phrase for one who looks back at the present across deep time, 100,000 or a million years from now, to discern which piece of geologic evidence, the lingering trace of what we now experience as byproducts of contemporary life, will have definitively indexed that epoch-making turn toward anthropogenic alteration and eventual self-obliteration, right? So somewhere in the deep future, some species is like picking something up from the rubble and being like, aha, this is the thing that drove the humans to be extinct. Right? Seen in this light, the Anthropocene project centers around a peculiarly spectral future anteriority. Following the conceit established in The Earth After Us, it often imagines its retro-projection of the present as taking place in the wake of human extinction, a reading accomplished by some other sentient species, whether earthly or alien. So he thinks it could be rats, it could be cockroaches, it could be aliens coming down, but it's not going to be us because we're extinct. Now, constructing the Anthropocene around human extinction demands, as Claire Colebrook has observed, that we learn to think and perceive as if our world could be readable in the absence of what we now take to be readers, which is humans. Yet its experiment with self-annihilation, thinking from the other side of the human, is lined by self-preservation. It becomes a ritual of proleptic mourning for the human species that works to consolidate a certain human subject. Colebrook explains, we now narcissistically imagine the tragedy of the post-human future as one in which death and absence will be figured through the unreadability of our own fragments, as though our self-alienation through archive and monument leads some sentiment that we ought to remain as readers of ourselves. Now, that sentiment marks the point at which anticipatory anxiety gives way to restorative grief, where tragedy becomes elegy, right? Where Ahab's doom gives way to Ishmael's recounting thereof, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And here is where the Anthropocene gains its putatively political force. Right? The confrontation with the death of the human presumably is meant to awaken us, right? And they often call it a wake-up call, right? Inspiring action meant to curtail the ongoing extinction event. And yet the existential dread aroused by anthropocenic self-mourning, as Colebrook points out, is too often assuaged by the hope that geoengineering and other technocentric solutions will magically appear as our salvation. Right? Paul Crutzen, for instance, the author of the original proposal, has come out in favor of experimenting with atmospheric sulfites as a means of reversing global warming. Right? You may have seen Snowpiercer. Right? You know how that ends. The expansive fantasy of the geological post-human thus seeks into defensive retreat to the forms of thought and habits of living characterizing the original reading's subject. Now, to understand the very particular we that makes this dual crossing, speculation and then retreat, right, we need to look back at Foucault's understanding of the threshold of modernity as paradox. Right? Its positioning in relation to biopower is a revision of the concept, which Foucault had first used to mark a stage in the emergence of man, again, that invention of recent European origin as he describes them in The Order of Things. Right? Foucault alludes to the earlier study in the later run, noting that it is the emergence of man in relation to the modern transformation of life that becomes the condition of possibility for biopower. Right. In The Order of Things, Foucault ties this division to 18th century European developments in the natural sciences, right? And particularly for him, one of the most important stages is Georges Cuvier's recognition of species extinction, right? Situating what that is, Foucault identifies as the origins of modern biology in the space of the geological via the study of fossils, which after Cuvier also become the primary means of organizing the geological timescale, right? That's how they can tell how old the Earth is, by looking at which fossils appear when. This understanding of life paves the way, in turn, for the emergence of the philosophical paradox that Foucault names the Analytic of Finitude, where famously man emerges as a creature, quote, bound to a finitude that belongs only to him, and which opens up the truth of the world to him. Right? The appearance of this conundrum, Foucault observes, constitutes what he calls the threshold beyond which we recognize our modernity. Right? And here, the boundary marker is rendered epistemologically, right? Distinct from the ontological sense, threshold of modernity, in which it appears at the later moment in the history of sexuality, right? By which point we may assume global imperial biopower has managed to inscribe man's finitude on the face of the planet itself. Now, the order of things famously positions man as a logical contradiction that may eventually collapse in on itself and vanish. Yet this hypothesis, I think, constitutes one of Foucault's rare moments of optimism, or more likely a blind spot generated by his own chronic underattentiveness to the dynamics of colonialism. Sylvia Wynter more precisely identifies the generation of man as the effect of a much longer colonizing process, which overwrote religious, juridical, scientific, and economic forms of European man as the human, against peoples defined as non, sub, or extra-human largely on the basis of race. It is this version of man overrepresenting itself as the imperiled human species that centers the tragic vision of the Anthropocene, Ahab's Anthropocene. Instead of disappearing, man has perpetuated himself through a canny combination of affective, aesthetic, economic, and biopolitical strategies that render finitude productive by projecting it outward on the one hand onto a range of death-marked populations, and on the other, internalizing it as the romantic self-fission we know primarily as melancholia, the foundation of modern Western subjectivity, and the psychic correlate of the two genres, tragedy and elegy, that organize the Anthropocene's mode of political protest. All this is to say that the paradoxical modernity overrepresented man recognizes as his, now manifesting as climate crisis in the vision of the Anthropocene, is less an historical period than the melancholy temporal miasma with which this interminably riven creature surrounds himself, all the while drawing life figuratively and materially from others. The Anthropocene concept projects the interminable cross-referencing of man's finitude across deep time. We're going to become extinct. We can't become extinct. We stop. No. Yet in doing so, it may simply prolong this crossing rather than undoing it. Now, just as the depth of the geological past, instead of, and this is often said in the humanities today, instead of obliterating merely human, ephemeral, silly forms like nations, right, as Shi Dimmock, for example, has brilliantly argued that it should, but somehow it's managed instead to furnish them with a kind of monumental foundation, right? So if you think about it, for instance, how the exposed sandstone and shale layers of the US Southwest, Grand Canyon, have come to bespeak this kind of distinctly American grandeur despite their relatively recent annexation by that settler colonial nation. Right? So too, the deep geological future that the tragic Anthropocene brings into view, lined by the poignant irony of human self-cancellation, we drove ourselves into it, renders climate crisis an intriguingly existential human conundrum, right? And not, say, a set of concrete political problems that we need to solve. Rather than vanishing, as Foucault predicted, like a face in the sand at the edge of the sea, the image of overrepresented man is now via the Anthropocene hardening into geologic strata. And as it folds into self-elegy, the epic emerges as yet another rendition of overrepresented man's capacity to arrange his death as a form of self-sustenance, right? An epistemological and affective romance with the limit, generating a sense of human exceptionalism, right? Aided again by the projection of a non-transcendental morbidity onto non-Western populations, especially in the global South, who likewise play a peculiar part in the Anthropocene debates. Right? They're depicted always with moral urgency and somehow in these debates without narrative agency, like they're not in the conversation. Hence, a proposal that purported to rupture the present, to alter its course, threatens to become merely more of the same. Okay, this is the second part. It's called Pip's Ecologies, reading number 2. I then want to move away from this account of the Anthropocene as it manifests in this reading of Melville's novel in order to explore how Moby Dick can make legible not only the broader histories of the present crisis, but also ways of approaching that crisis other than the tragic mode. Specifically, I want to explore the cognate form allegorized by the castaway Pip, the black American cabin boy driven mad by a temporary but terrifying abandonment at sea, prolonged by the second mate Stubbs' decision to continue pursuing a fleeing whale instead of rescuing Pip after he's jumped out of the whaleboat in terror. As Ishmael recounts the experience, and this is the second passage, which I want to spend some time with, the sea had jeeringly kept his finite body up, but drowned the infinite of his soul. Not drowned entirely, though, rather carried down alive to wondrous depths, where strange shapes of the unwarped primal world glided to and fro before his passive eyes, and the miser merman wisdom revealed his hoarded heaps. And among the joyous, heartless, ever juvenile eternities, Pip saw the multitudinous God omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament waters heaved the colossal orbs. He saw God's foot upon the treadle of the loom and spoke it, and therefore his shipmates called him mad. So man's insanity is heaven's sense, and wandering from all mortal reason, man comes at last to that celestial thought which to reason is absurd and frantic, and weal or woe feels then uncompromised, indifferent as his God. Pip's vision of oceanic depths aligns the non-human or more than human forms of life glimpsed there with an indifference rendered here celestial, a profound revelation of human insignificance. The notion of the oceanic is often positioned as a check to human narcissism, a reminder of the world beyond man. Although lakes, seas, and oceans, as Charles Lyell reflected in his Principles of Geology, constitute the greater part of the inhabited surface of our planet, they have no immediate relation to the human race, and may still remain as insensible of our presence, he says, as before any isle or continent was appointed to be our residence. The Oceanic Index is another temporality, apart from the progressive time said to be the space of overrepresented man's reason and human evolution. It is a space of perpetual renewal here, ever juvenile eternities. Now, in his reading of this passage, C.L.R. James positions Pip's madness, so-called, as a counterpoint to the insanity of the perpetual preoccupation with human destiny, the thing that was eating the heart out of Ahab, Ishmael, and Starbuck. This is a preoccupation suffered only by those who cannot make satisfactory contact with the reality around them, unlike Pip in his immersion in that reality. Like another number of other critics, James situates Pip in the tradition of the Shakespearean fool, a perpetually simple and, for James, universal figure. In a distressingly ableist take on crypt time, James identifies the fool with an ethical, simple directness that sidesteps the circuitous routes taken by the majority of intelligent men, and which, though it cannot be followed by them, haunts them like a prophecy in the wake of the catastrophes brought about by worldly wisdom, the people who think too much. More recent eco-critical takes on this passage comprehend the model of being in the world presented by Pip in terms of material rather than moral directness, finding the experience of his fusion of animal, vegetable, and mineral life an alternative materialism of the body, which removes Pip from the contractual bonds with Ahab as the figure of overrepresented man. There is, I think, a good deal of satisfaction in this sensory and sensual take on Pip's immersion. Pip becomes sort of one with the material of the ocean, right? Both as it corrects James' ableism and as it positions the presence of the planetary as an alternative to the temporal looping of so-called worldliness. Yet, the new materialist take on Pip, like much new materialist thought in general, may go too far in suffusing the non-human world with a relative innocence, a non-implication of the catastrophes of human history, which is closer to the romantic take on nature than the Castaway chapter as a whole can support. Pip's contact, that is, with the ocean's ever-juvenile eternities is not conditioned by childlike innocence, but by the peculiar atemporality that Edward Glissant, in Poetics of Relation, names the second abyss, the sea as experienced by the enslaved thrown overboard. Countering Lyell's figure of the oceanic as detemporal indifference to the human, Glissant insists that the ocean remains imbued with the material memory of the slave trade. Instead of eternities, it is the locus of the negated time, the time of enslavement, that originates modernity as we know it, founded in and through the transatlantic slave trade. This is Glissant. In actual fact, the abyss is a tautology. The entire ocean, the entire sea, gently collapsing in the end into the pleasures of sand, make one vast beginning, but a beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green. If Pip's immersion signals a mode of contact with the non-human world of the ocean, it is nevertheless a perspective rendered from a position of dehumanization, the negation or social death suffered by the enslaved as the very condition of man's overrepresentation. Pip's madness, that is not universal or eternal condition, but a located, distinctively modern one. In this sense, the geohistorical cognate that Pip's experience allegorizes is that of the Plantationist scene. The term itself was proposed by Donna Haraway and Anna Singh at a symposium in 2015 discussing alternatives to the Anthropocene, but its ideas have been anticipated in earlier work by Winter, Catherine McKittrick, and other scholars in African diaspora studies. The Plantationist scene framework describes not a site, but a globalizing process of extraction, displacement, and alienation. It considers, as Haraway puts it, the historical relocations of the substances of living and dying around the earth as a necessary prerequisite to their extraction. It generates then a more comprehensive historical framework incorporating New World slavery as a key element of contemporary environmental crisis, yet the discussions introducing the term, as some critics have recently argued, have been marked by a too hasty move to a multi-species framing that minimizes the role of racial politics in this history. In this light, I suggest we need to tarry with the parts played by blackness and by racialized chattel slavery in Pip's story if we were to consider it a Plantationist scene allegory. Now, it's important here, I think, that Pip is not enslaved. He's identified as a native of Tolland County, Connecticut, born presumably free, and has himself contracted, unfortunately as it turns out, his position on the ship. His blackness, however, situates him in perpetual proximity to the slave system, however separate his own experience may be. This is underscored by Stubb, captain of the whaleboat on which Pip, inexperienced and frightened, has been pulled into service. The first time that Pip jumps out of the boat, he ends up tangled in the rope attached to Tashdigo's harpoon, which is landed in the whale, and Stubb orders him cut loose, saving Pip from strangulation but losing the whale. Stubb tries at first to persuade Pip that it's a bad idea to jump out of the boat, but he realizes that the appeals to Pip's reason leaves him too much freedom to think for himself. So instead, he issues a command, he says, not to jump, buttressed by an equation rendering Pip's value in relation to the animal. Quote, "We can't afford to lose whales like the likes of you. A whale would sell for 30 times what you would, Pip, in Alabama." Now, the hypothetical commodification of Pip's black body on the American scene does not need to be actualized to accomplish its cultural work. Pip, from this moment, is positioned in relation to slavery, and it is from this position that he jumps out of the boat a second time and finds himself abandoned, just as Stubb had threatened to do. Whatever vision Pip possesses in the wake of his immersion in the depths, then, can't be thought of simply as a direct accession of material world or sort of universal simplicity. It is a contact enacted as the effect of ejection from the form of man to the edges of the human. Deprived of reason, Pip is, as Sylvia Wynter would say, made into the physical referent of the idea of the irrational, sub-rational human other. Right? He reflects not, that is, the positive, proliferating, more than human presence of the material world as such, but the critical vision issued from the situation of negation assigned to blackness at the border between human and non in the modernizing West. As a reminder of this, in the wake of his immersion, he speaks of himself in the third person always as dead, animating what has been identified as the social death peculiar to enslavement. Now, we might further extend this reading of Pip's story as an allegory of the plantation scene by means of Ishmael's introduction of the incident, which he describes at the outset of the Castaway chapter as a most significant event, he says, which befell the most insignificant of the Pequod's crew, an event most lamentable, and which ended in providing the sometimes madly merry and predestinated craft with the living and ever-comforting prophecy of whatever shattered sequel might prove her own. Pip's immersion, that is, foreshadows the eventual and thereafter inevitable drowning of the Pequod, and Pip's presence serves as a perpetual prophetic reminder of this later, as yet unscripted event. Ishmael's introductory aside ascribes to this singular event the power associated with allegory as an anticipation of later and larger events. Read within the plantation scene framework, it identifies in the peculiar violence of New World slavery the roots of the eventual destruction of the world as a whole. Yet though it offers a more expansive historical frame, this kind of reading does not escape the problems noted with respect to Ahab's Anthropocene. That is, it situates this history within a narrative that is entirely tragic, deterministic, indeed apocalyptic. Moreover, it renders the later consequent violence, the end of the ship, as not merely a shattered sequel, but the main event, the story's telos. Hence, it relies, as Matt Hooley has written in another Anthropocene context, on the necropolitical identification of a vulnerable population or figure as a way of making global environmental harm legible. Despite its ostensible claim of shared damage, it can become another way of exporting, localizing, and thus warding off finitude. We might note along these lines that however unsettling his prophetic example might be in Ishmael's eyes, Ahab's fondness for Pip in the wake of his abandonment indicates the kind of consolation that may accompany this singular situation of blackness as social death from a white perspective. It's worth remembering then, as we consider the plantation-scene framework, that African Americanists and decolonial analyses of the plantation don't confine their assessment of its destructiveness to a particular past historical space or time, but demonstrate, for instance, how it continues to inform contemporary spaces like the prison industrial complex. Right? And importantly, they also don't stop there. They explore ways that Black life persists in these contexts, how these contexts were able, as McKittrick contends, to bring forth a poetics that envisions a decolonial future. Right? The figure of Pip, as some readers have observed, likewise manages to allegorize other ways of being in relation to human as well as non-human others. Right? But in this sense, it's a much smaller allegory. It's not the big picture story. It happens in moments, right? Like very small moments that you really need to be paying attention to the novel to really catch the significance of. Right? So Christopher Freeberg, for instance, identifies in this character a locus of what he terms Melville's blackness, which signifies at once a disruptive positioning of powerlessness and the crafting of alternative forms of connection, informed by West African and African American cultural practice. Right? With these in mind, Freeberg insists Pip cannot be seen as signifying alienation, displacement, or social death alone, right? Pip also introduces into the novel aesthetic forms, most notably the tambourine drum beat that serves as foundation for the ring shout and the funeral song that underscore the multisensory and intimate connections of Black communal life. Right? Beyond the confines of social death, Melville uses the character, he argues, to create an embodied Blackness that asks a really good question: what kind of life is worth living, or that matter worth dying for? Right? C.L.R. James also positions Pip as the key to an alternative ethical vision of the novel. Right, one he identifies with the world Melville saw ahead, right, which is indexed in the collective labors and life of the crew. Right. Despite, or rather because of his visit to the abyss, Pip is identified by Ishmael as occupying the highest place in his story, an ascension that culminates for James when Pip, locked away in Ahab's cabin as the novel draws to its close, imagines himself entertaining great admirals. And he says, "What an odd feeling now when a black boys host a white man with gold lace upon their coats." Pip muses a moment that James describes as one of the most strangely moving passages in the whole book. He's really caught by that. And it takes place in like a sentence or two, but James is really struck. Right? In it lies some of the essential elements for the new humanism that for James will be the only means by which Western civilization will survive. That is, by dissolving itself into the radical democracy of global citizenship based on the kind of equality and good fellowship envisioned in this theme. Pip's story is then not an allegory of the world remaking violence named in the plantation is seen, but not only. It also embraces ways that, as McKittrick reminds us, other forms of kinship and connection, other social practices, and indeed other worlds could be imagined from the very sites inscribed by that violence. Pip's experience in the abyss exemplifies precisely this sort of generative labor. If you look back at that passage, you recall that amidst the joyous, heartless, ever-juvenile eternities, Pip saw the multitudinous God omnipresent coral insects that out of the firmament of waters heaved the colossal orbs. Right? This passage references an early geologic theory that coral was created by millions of tiny invisible insects, right? And that the material thus produced was the basis of the continents, right? The colossal orbs that are heaved out of the waters. By the time Melville wrote, the theory had already been declared scientifically incorrect, yet it was still immensely popular, serving, as some critics have outlined, as a 19th century theory of work, right? Which could be repurposed in numerous ways. Right? And for instance, writing in 1859, the black physician and abolitionist James McCune Smith deployed the coral insect as an allegory of black intellectual and cultural production. Right? He highlights the difficult, noiseless, persevering, and long-term labor of the man of color, he says man, in the United States, who knows that the progress of mankind is entrusted to his keeping. Right? Pip, in like manner, both envisions and enacts an alternative minoritarian geology of humankind. Right? Not tragic, but radically hopeful, connecting to the multitudinous coral insects, to the crew, and innumerable others as they work both literally and figuratively to make new worlds. Right? I don't know if we need to stop at a particular time. Right? So I'm done with the talk, but I wanted to say a word because I know that some of you are actually reading Moby Dick. So to close, I actually wanted to say a word on the question about reading, and reading in the present and reading in the crisis. Right? So I choose Moby Dick for this project, which is allegorizing the Anthropocene and its many cognates, right? Partly because it's a really big book. Right? It can support almost any number of readings. Right? As James remarked in a letter to the literary critic Jay Leda, he said, Melville attempted to include everything and relate everything to everything. Right? And so it's this really sort of endless project of reading it. Right? But it's also just a book I love. Like, it's a book I just endlessly, genuinely love to read. Right? And this is one of the reasons I also linger with C.L.R. James. Right? In addition to being interested in James himself as an intellectual figure, right? He also loves Moby Dick, right? And I love just watching him love the book, right? So there's this sort of dual love going on, right? So I wanted to say a bit about love and about pleasure, right? In particular, the pleasure of reading as an index of pleasure in general, right? Pleasure as a kind of necessary political praxis at the present time, right? So I think the combined weight of the world historical crises that I've just barely begun to gesture toward in my talk today is crushing, right? Like any one of them considered on its own is really enormous, right? I think it's a really frightening time to be alive. I think it must be a really difficult time to be young, right? In the face of all of this, I think it might feel like a really insupportable luxury to have to be asked to take the time out to read, much less to enjoy reading, a really long, difficult, terrifying, beautiful book, right? But that feeling that it's a luxury is a feeling I'd really want to resist, right? I won't pretend that the answers to the problems facing the world today are like somewhere hidden in the pages of Moby Dick. I probably should have spoiler alerted that question too. Yeah, maybe they are. You'll keep going, keep reading, right? But yeah, no, I don't think that they are directly there, right? But I do think that the work and the pleasure of reading it help us to understand how we might begin to approach those problems, right? And I think it's really easy in a crisis to neglect the importance of pleasure, right? Just the importance of pleasure in itself, but it is a deadly error to do so. If there remains any utility to reading in the Anthropocene, it won't come from genres, I think, poised to deliver these really tight moral lessons about the epic, our tragic imprisonment within it. Right? Rather, I think it's more about a diffused, more capacious, sort of more catching in the moment mode of reading, like I tried to do with the later discussion of Pip. Right? The point, I think, is that reading is best, it's like a practice, it's a vocation, right? It's one of many, right? Not just reading, but reading, I think, is important here, that might find us reasons as well as means to live through and to move on from the present, right? Including, I think, a sustained attentiveness to pleasure as well as pain, pointing toward the ongoing necessity in these difficult times of tragedy, whimsy, critique and speculation, mourning and enjoyment, as we take up the work, the great deal of work there remains to be done. So, thanks. So, I don't know if do you have time for questions, thoughts, comments, denunciations, digressions? Kevin?
I have a question. Well, thank you. I love when scholars come and just embody what I want my students to aspire to be like. So that was absolutely terrific. So thank you for that. And also, praise for Melville. You can't do enough for that either. This will sound like more like a comment, but it is a question because I genuinely don't know.
Right.
It sounds like one of the values of reading Melville within this massively urgent and important debate is that he allows, or at least I inferred from your talk, that he allows for a kind of pretty radical rejection of romanticism in a way. That the problem with romanticism is it's an engagement with nature, but ultimately in the service of what Emerson calls the age of the first person singular. So the problem with romanticism, it's not anthro-decentric enough.
Right.
Where is romanticism in your thinking? To what extent is it a problem? Has it been a problem in the way the West, the way Americans read the natural world, and how does Melville help facilitate this sort of intervention or educating readers in how the natural world should be read against the romantic tradition? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Right, yeah. That's a really great question, a really big one. I would say, I think that romanticism is really difficult to break with then as now, right? I think Melville struggled with it. I think C.L.R. James really struggles with it, right? Like, I think that, there's a sort of part of his Marxist commitments really required him to break with romanticism, but he's also really as much as he uses Melville to critique dynamics of the individual, right? And there, I think, if you read Mountaineers, Renegades, and Castaways, he actually, he sort of, flips this sort of habit that critics had fallen into of opposing Melville and, of Ahab and Ishmael, like, Ahab's the bad totalitarian Trump guy, right, which, he's still being read as an allegory for Trump today, really, I think, persuasively, except he's a lot smarter. But Ishmael is like the, free-spirited intellectual, and James is like, no, actually, it's all of those guys on one side, right? Like, and then there's the crew, right? And the crew is this sort of non-individuated, right? Like burgeoning, right? Mess of types, right? Like there are types, they're people, right? It's not like you need to sort of meld into the soup, right? But they don't think of themselves as individualists, right? They're laborers, right? And so I think that's, I think it's a fabulous reading of Moby Dick. I think, though, that there's this sort of lure of romanticism that pulls back people educated in the Western philosophical tradition, and it pulls back Ishmael. And the reason I opened with these geological chapters, right, the cetological chapters in general, right, which many people think of as the boring parts of Moby Dick, right, until you read them out loud. If you can't read them out loud because they are delicious, right? But it's just because they're all this sort of wacky play on words, right? And you're like, oh no, I don't care about whales, but you will, right? Or you won't care about whales, but you'll care about the words that care about the whales, right? But geology itself, right? Geology itself is founded, and it's sort of interesting that it's always sort of held up as this thing that negates any form of the human. Like, who cares about you individuals, right? Because the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, the universe is this big, right? It's supposed to be this thing that overwhelms, right? But it actually confirms this sort of form of romantic individualism, right? And if you sort of go back and read actually some of the British Romantic poets were best friends with some of the early geologists of their day and like writing letters back and forth, right, sort of discussing these ideas. And so there's this way in which, again, this supposed annihilation of the human in geology actually just sort of sends it rebounding back on itself, right? And that's the dilemma I'm trying to look at in this book as a whole, right? So I'm trying to think about what kinds of fantasy, what kinds of non-individual, dehuman fantasy geology has authorized in the 19th century, right? But also the ways that geology has historically functioned as the science of settler colonialism. I mean, it just has, right? It just remaps, sort of the world and its extracting image, right? And so how those two things play out in tension. So I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but it's a sort of, my argument is in a sense that it's still going on, right? It's still going on in the Anthropocene proposal today, right? And it's still going on in the ways that we sort of pit this sort of battle with extinction as, right, the final sort of like, tension between man and nature. Okay. Sir? Yes. Oh, you mean for Melville? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and often in terms of the allegory that's spelled out there as man and nature, right? You're sort of like, what is the idea of going? And it's brought up in a lot of different ways. Like, why are you going to war with, right, this magnificent whale species, but also, why are you going to war with an animal, right? Like that, it doesn't make any sense, right? So there's this sort of sense that, the non-human world is being treated unfairly, but then there's also this sort of sense, this Starbucks sense, this, trying to hold off Ahab's quest for vengeance in the name of capitalism, right? Like, oh no, we, don't go after this one whale. We need to kill as many whales as possible, right? So leave this one whale alone, right? So there's this sort of way in which, again, I think that people read, the people who read Moby Dick, and there's this sort of, like Melville wrote these really, he wrote both tidier adventure stories and then like really messy books beforehand, right? So Moby Dick had something of a sort of mixed critical reception at the time it was released, right? And a lot of people saw it as a whaling story, right? And I was like, oh, it's a good whaling story. But of course, given the ending, which I spoiled, but won't spoil again, just in case people did cover their ears, right? There's this sort of sense of like, okay, and that, like the radical apocalyptic ending of that novel needs to mean something, right? So people are reading it for something more, right? Like, what is that actually about, right? It's not just the story of a boat, right? So I think, that the kinds of allegories I'm mapping here are sort of presentist allegories. And one of the things I want to argue is that we always read, in a sense, from our moment in time. And this is the thing that, most of your English professors will tell you don't do, right? So I'm doing the bad, and I actually tell my students don't do it, so I'm being a hypocrite. I just come to another campus to be a terrible hypocrite. No, I tell them, it is like, I teach 19th century sexuality, so I'm like, don't look for gay people, right? But also don't look for straight people, because these are 20th century, 21st century identities, right? You're going to find different things in 19th century novels, right? But then there's also a way in which I'm very sympathetic. There's a great book called Closet Writing, Gay Reading, which is about Melville's next novel, Pierre, right? And it's arguing, in a sense, that this is a gay book, right? And it's not a gay book, right? But it's a gay book, right? And so it's become, in a sense of circulation and rereading, right? A 19th, a sort of classic gay novel, right? Argues James Creech, right? And I want to actually really credit that, right? Like it's not to say, oh, he's wrong, right? All those people who are reading it as gay are just bad historical readers, right? They're reading it from the sense of a present need, right? And they're circulating it amongst themselves, and they're having conversations about this book, which is ostensibly about heterosexuality, if you've read it, or if you ever do read it, and I won't spoil it, right? Or I should say it's about opposite sexuality, because there's no heterosexuality until the end of the 19th century, right? So there's this way in which I actually do want to do this thing, which is to say that we all read from the present. Like people, you read books and you identify, like, I like that person. I would want to be friends with that person. That person's relatable or whatever, right? And that, even that is sort of violating the rules of historicism. You don't know that person, right? You don't know, you have no idea if you can identify with that person. You're a 21st century subject, they're 19th century subjects, right? What I'm trying to do is, in a sense, to say we do actually make connections with the past for all sorts of reasons and for all sorts of needs. And I don't think it is unimportant, right, to know things about the 19th century. I don't think it's unimportant. You have to, since you have to know what the whaling industry is doing at that moment in time, right? You have to know, like, there's so many references you have to look in your footnotes to know. Some of them are unimportant, some of them are you can get along without them. Some of them are essential, right? But so I think knowing stuff about the historical moment is essential, but it's not, it doesn't finally exhaust the ways that you can connect to the novel. If you think, if C.L.R. James thinks this is a book about fascism, right? Like this is actually, there's no fascism in the 20th century sense when Melville's writing, but it works really well. And he's very persuasive about it, right? People argue this is a book about the contemporary situation of American politics today, right? That works really well too as an allegory. Melville didn't know this was going to happen, but it works as a kind of reading. And if it gets you to think about it, if it gets you to sort of understand it in a new way, I think that's a really justifiable reading. So, yes?
Thank you so much for this is all really, really intriguing. But also I'm a bit confused by a couple of things.
Okay.
A twofold question.
Okay.
My first question would be, I really like the idea of how you relate Anthropocene to emotions. You specifically talk about grief and tragedy,
right,
and the representation in Anthropocene. But I also wanted to, I guess, can you clarify to me, especially how grief and tragedy are represented,
right,
but also when the other part that really struck me was how, especially when you were talking about Pip, maternity is Anthropocene in the non-white individuals. I hope that question makes sense.
Okay.
How they relate to one another.
Okay, right, yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, I think, again, sort of the Anthropocene as tragedy, right, is this sort of idea, right, if you know this sort of model of tragedy is that, this sort of hero as facing a flaw that comes from within, right? It's not the only model of tragedy there is, right? But the sort of modern tragic form is like, here comes this hero, right? Which works with Ahab, right? Like Ahab just can't get over the whale, right? He just can't get over the whale. And so he's got, just like everything is mowed down in his wake of this quest for but it's him, right? It's him. It's not like it is this sort of insanity that comes from within him, right? So this is the idea that, for example, Chakrabarty, I think, is really smartly diagnosing, what is it with this, crazy, we need more and more and more freedom in the form of fossil fuel driven transportation industry, ways of making money, et cetera. Why are we killing ourselves, right? But at the same time, I think one of the reasons I'm wary of that is this sort of there's a whole lot of conflation of ourselves. Some people are doing the killing and other people are doing the dying, right? So that, I think that sort of idea of modeling it on the tragic individual needs to be disarticulated because it's a sort of, some people are actually, we're not just doing it because we're wacky. Some people are doing it because they're making money, right? And they're profiting off, right? And so I feel like that it turns it into a psychological problem. And when you turn something into a psychological problem, you run the risk, if you don't, I think it's useful to think about the psychological questions of this, why do people convince themselves of things that are not supposedly in their self-interest, right? But if you sort of make it this weird existential psychological problem, you stop thinking these are the things that could be done, right? We actually, this climate change is not a mystery, right? We know how to end it. We know how to end it, and we're just not doing it, right? The why of that is another question, right? But it's not, there's not this big, it's just we as humans are just driven to kill ourselves somehow. We're not. Right. So the second question, I think, is that right, on the one hand, there are these modes, right, like the plantationist scene and the colonial scene, which is saying, look, Anthropocene, it didn't just happen that people just started driving cars and then choked on their own exhaust. A whole bunch of other things had to happen first, and global populations were exploited in ways that this narrow story doesn't begin to, and continue to be exploited in ways that this narrow story doesn't cover, right? So I want to use this book, because all of that is there too, right? It's all in this book. I want to use this book and I want to use these stories, plantationist scene, colonial scene, which I didn't get to talk about, which actually thinks about, again, there's a proposal for the Anthropocene. It's the only scientific ones. Most of these don't make sort of geologic claims. They know that the scientists aren't interested, right? They basically, especially because of the reception of the 1610 proposal. So there's an argument to be made that one of the things that happened is, as you know, you probably know, right, sort of in the century plus after Columbian contact, right, 90% of the indigenous populations of the Americas, of both continents, died, right, in roughly a century, right, and because of that, there are ecological effects which produced a drop actually in carbon levels. We now have carbon levels rising, but they produced a drop in carbon levels, right, which made Earth temperatures fluctuate, et cetera. And it can actually be traced in carbon cores in, ice cores sort of in the Arctic. Like they go really deep and they can figure out sort of what happened in the past. Right? So there is this sort of scientific evidence saying this thing happened, right? Like carbon levels rose, and the argument is, in a sense, it wasn't actually so much the decimation of the population itself, but the reforestation that happened to the continents, right? So there's a really complicated ecological argument through which these are actually ecologically minded geologists. They don't do the deep Earth history. Can actually trace this event, right? Trace the sort of material effects on this event and say this actually changed the world, right? You know, there's this way in which, you know, just masses of people die and other people just keep looking right past, right? So there's this sort of sense that, well, at least the planet remembers this story, right? But it was just like, it was not what the Anthropocene people had in mind. Like they just didn't want to, I mean, I can't, you have to sort of read their article. And it's actually it's not deeply scientific. Like you can read it with, you know, some of it is slow going, but you can actually read it. It's a critique of it where it's this sort of like, well, this is not about a human story. It's not about genocide. Like, stop talking about genocide. That's not what the Anthropocene is about, and it's really, you know, it's just this desire not to tell the story. So what I want to do is also think about the ways in which these other frameworks are just the frameworks that are going to tell these stories. Like, no, this is actually, it's a story about mass death. It's a story about mass exploitation, right? It's a story about the enslavement of entire populations, right? It's a story about, right, all of these kinds of extractive violence that are the story of modernity, like taking bodies out of one place, putting other bodies in their place, forcing them to do work, right? So remaking the world in this way, right? This is the sort of violence that has led to contemporary ecological crisis, right? It's not just that we're all driving our cars too much, although we're all driving our cars too much, right? But that's not the story, right? The whole of the story, right? But I also want to say, like, I don't want to sort of perpetuate, like, and the only thing we can do now is this gloom and doom mindset. Like, we just, you know, some people just screwed up the planet and all the people on it, and now we are just all doomed and we can do nothing but like endlessly mourn, right? I think that grief is necessary. I think that honoring that violence, past and present, is necessary, right? And it's ongoing, but I also think that it's not the only thing we can or should do, right? And so with Pip's story in particular, I'm following some critics, James Freeberg and some other critics who are thinking like, actually, this is a really interesting character, right? He's a really interesting character because he actually continues to, in his shattered self, and he's really shattered afterwards, but he also continues to bring pleasure, right? And he continues to have pleasure in his own life and to bring pleasure to others on the ship, right? In this way that is, it's not the sort of pleasure of like thinking about yourself, it's actually a more communal pleasure. It's the pleasure of being with others, right? And so in tracing these back to both African American and West African cultural practices, some critics are arguing in a sense that these are values, right? These are values we can see developing alongside modernity, right? Alongside the violence done, right, to peoples of the African diaspora, right? That persist and that remain values that should be retained, right? Should be valued, should be learned from, right? So if we're trying to think about sort of what ways in which we can start to fix things, these are ways that we need to think. So, thank you for that question. It's a great question. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, you kind of talked about the threshold of modernity, like how we grasp it, but we don't. And I was wondering what you think Melville, or what you think makes the world readable. Like what phenomena makes the world readable?
What phenomena makes the world readable?
Education, experience.
Okay. Oh, really? That's a really good question, right? I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by read, right? So, you know, I think that, I mean, one of the threshold of modernity becomes recognition from a certain, you know, what Foucault means by that is actually a sort of recognition in relation to like a double sort of movement of looking back at yourself from outside yourself, but always being inside yourself, right? Which is a form of legibility. Some people would say it's the only true form of legibility. I don't think that's true necessarily, right? So I think that there are different ways. It depends on what you're reading for that makes the world legible, right? For geologists, right, and this is one of their quarrels with the Anthropocene, like they're actually looking for something that is written on the planet, right? And like from the debates of legibility, if you're into sort of debates about legibility, geologic legibility, it's super interesting, right? One of their arguments, you know, so they've decided on nuclear weapons, and part of it is that, like, they made legibility the point of what was going to be read. So like, well, we don't know about that 1610, 1492 thing, and also like there's not that much evidence about the late 18th century, but you know what really changed the planet? Nuclear weapons. You can, if you have your radioactive isotope detector, which of course they all do, right? You can just find it in bedrock around the globe, and it's true, actually. The first detonation of a nuclear weapon actually changed the face of the planet, right? So that in a sense was legible, but they're also looking for other sort of ways of reading, like this is the moment that changed the world, this is the age that changed the world, right? And one of them, I think, actually, is sort of interesting. A former colleague of mine actually had proposed, and it was rejected because it was like too poetic. He's a humanist, right? So he made this really poetic way of reading the world. And he's like, well, we're not going to just read, we're not going to declare that what we're reading is the isotopes that are left in the rock itself, but the nuclear age, the age in which nuclear weapons were exploded above ground, is from 1945 to, I think, 1962 or 63, right, when there was this overground test ban, right? And the bones and teeth, especially the teeth of all mammals who lived during those years, contains radioactive traces, right? So there's this sort of radioactivity that people are walking around with. And so his argument was what the legibility of the Anthropocene will be is the fossilized bones and teeth of those mammals, humans, and others, which I like because, again, he's writing a much more poetic story, which is like modernity can be read. The sort of like violent moment of the threshold of modernity can be read not just in rock, but in the way that life itself died but bore a trace of this, right? Now, some of those people will have died from the after effects of that radiation poisoning, right? But many of those people did not, but still it's sort of using an entire generation of people to tell a story about what happened to the planet, right? But I think that part of the problem with those sort of big markers of legibility is that they miss stuff like Pip, right? Again, that's that moment that James finds one of the most strangely moving passages of the whole book is a sentence and a half, right? It requires close reading, it requires paying attention, right, to a character that is obviously significant if you've read the novel, but we're also told over and over again he's insignificant, right? He's discounted because he's black, he's discounted because he goes crazy, he's discounted because he's young, he's like, he's a kid, he's not a grown adult yet, right? So he's discounted over and over again, and yet he's important, but you have to pay attention, right? Like he's not Ahab, on the other hand. Ahab is everywhere. If you're reading the book, if you've got like 10 pages in, you'll notice that there are symbols of death all over the place. Like it's sort of famously, like there's a giant gravestone shadow over this novel, right? So that is sort of, it's almost camp, right? It's really playing it up. Like, by the way, this book is about death, right? But it's also about other things, right? It's about different kinds of life. And I think that kind of life can make the world legible in a really different way.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay.
Hi.
So just coming back to Pip and talking about the kind of like the model of global citizenship that's within him, what's the biggest risk you see in having that model built on him and how that feeds into the idea of radical hope in a novel that ends with the death of everyone?
Oh, okay. All right, that's a really great question, right? I think it's in part, it's part of one of the vexed problems of Moby Dick is that everyone almost dies, right? But also everyone lives on, right? I mean, that's part of the point of the book itself as a record, right? Because it's written, after the ending, right? In the wake of the ending, as Ishmael keeps sort of telling you, I'm writing a story about this thing that happened, right? And it's happening, it continues to happen, right? And so he's writing it in a sense to bring it back to life, which is part of what, part of the only thing that we can do, right? I mean, we pass on as individuals, right? So one of the things that we try to think about is ways in which we can retain what is passed on, right? Retain what is passed on and continue to transmit it, right? I think, in a sense, James understands himself as part of a struggle that he may not live to see the end of, right? And I think we may be part of that same struggle that we may not live to see the end of, right? This sort of struggle for radical democracy, right? The struggle, right, against these kinds of violence and oppression, right? But he's arguing in a sense that the struggle is also itself worth it. Right? One of the things he does at the end of the book is he sort of writes about he's imprisoned. He actually writes this book from prison, And it's really, I mean, it becomes really relevant. Again, he's being detained at Ellis Island. While he's considered to be deported for un-American activities. He had applied to be a U.S. citizen, but instead they decided he didn't deserve to be a citizen because he was Marxist, right? And he was thrown out of the country. And he was detained for a while, which actually really hurt his health, and finally deported. But he writes this book in part to make a case against the deportation, right? So it's in part a sort of using Moby Dick as a polemic against the logic of borders, right? And in part using Moby Dick as a way of illuminating what kinds of social life go on in prisons, right? And he's saying, in a sense, that the prisoners I am with are like the crew, right? This is a really international bunch of people. This is a bunch of people who, like whatever you outsiders may think of prisoners, like just throw that idea out, right? Like there's a social life here. This is not just a bunch of people who've been put into suspended time, right? There's a whole other world happening here, right? And he doesn't, well, he romanticizes it a little, but he doesn't really romanticize it because it's prison, right? He's not pretending that things are good, right? There are real conflicts between him and some of the other people, right? It's not a sort of like tidy, happy version of utopia for him at all, but it is something, right? It's something that he can hold on to in the present to say, like, the world could look like these things I've seen here. Interacting with these other people. It doesn't, but it could someday, and I will hold on to this in the present. So I don't know if that answers your question, but okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much for talking and for staying and for reading. Thank you.